get into the game now, which is the least fun part of the day, I think. But we'll try to break it down for everybody and sort of get into like the big notes about how the match went, and break it down and hopefully try to find a way to stay constructive and positive through talking about opening day.
Yeah, so I think probably the one of the bigger storylines to talk through is just how terrible this team looked in the first half of this game. I thought the first like 5 minutes or so had some promising moments, some showing like, okay, they're adapting a little bit from last year. They're doing something a little bit different. And then after those 5 minutes, it looked different, but still terrible and really, really bad.
Yeah, absolutely. So Minnesota, this is going to be my impression of it. It seemed like Minnesota came out in a high press, which is not like something Minnesota's naturally want to do, but it is something that seems to be very, very effective against Austin, because Austin seemed to have like no ideas for most of the first half. Am I accurately summing that up?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for some different reasons than what we saw last year. So we see the switch in the midfield. Alex Ring playing the lone six. Sebastian Driussi is a late scratch. It was announced, I think, the day before, a couple of days before, that he was questionable with a minor hamstring injury. Josh Wolf says after the game that it's nothing super serious. They don't expect him out for a long time, but kept him out of this game to the extent where he didn't even dress, wasn't on the bench. So the midfield was Alex Ring as a lone six, and then Danny Pereira and Owen Wolf as those dual tens. Owen Wolf stepping into that Driussi role. What ended up happening is it got really stretched out in the midfield and really disconnected, where we had our back line of four and Alex Ring trying to break the press on their own. And then Danny and Owen were pushed up quite high, playing as like where you'd expect them to be as they like get past midfield and are getting into that like past the build up phase of the attack and into like pushing into like that final third shape. Instead, it would often end up Alex Ring is not going to break the press on his own like Danny could, right? So it would often end up with him combining with center backs, and then as the pressure got too much, they would launch it upfield, and which is like, I mean, it's good to see that they're trying to play a little more vertically at times whenever that pressure does get too much. But when the passes aren't that great and there's nobody fast enough to really just play a hopeful ball past the back line and for them to run onto it, like it's not going to be super successful. And it wasn't very successful.
Yeah, I mean, you wouldn't say they were like strategically vertical, right? I mean, they were vertical because they were pinned back and didn't know what to do. Or do you think that was like part of the game plan?
There did seem to be a bit of strategy to it, but I think it's also partially what stretched the midfield out so much, because you would see Danny and Owen running, making like those vertical runs up those like inside channels every once in a while. And so hoping to catch the defense off guard, and that rarely worked. And then as they were staying up high, if the pressure started and they weren't already making that run, then that long ball is not going to work. And then also Alex Ring has no forward outlet to like break that line and play through. And so I think, what was it, the Galaxy game? Was that the preseason game that was streamed?
That was the one that was on. That was the one that we got to see. Yeah.
They were trying to break lines and play through those seams more often in that game, which was a thing I really like to see. But as that wasn't available, as Minnesota was clogging those lanes up and not letting them do that, they didn't have a backup plan. And that kind of just lasted the whole first half.
Yeah, I think to get into the numbers of that a little bit, and maybe we can get into the post-game comments from Josh Wolf too, because I think they were really evident. So in the first half, Minnesota United has basically 60% possession, because on FOTMOB, it's 14 shots to 3 and shots on target 7-1. I feel like I've seen it even more one-sided than that in other places. So it was just really, really non-competitive in the first half, and a big chances 6-0. So the most amazing thing from that first half is like how much work Brad Stuver had to do to keep it from completely falling apart.
Yeah, absolutely. It was defensively as well. Like there was like a bit of a shift in the defensive structure. I know last year was almost always that 4-4-2. They would try to press fairly often. This shape, they would like Danny Pereira would still fall back in next to Alex Ring, but then Owen Wolf and Drusy, we saw him do this in preseason as well. He would sit behind the striker and kind of mark their six or like their central midfielder. And so they were pressing less often, only really pressing as they would move the ball backwards and kind of invite it. And like there was kind of a signal in very specific moments to do that. Otherwise, they were sitting back a little bit. And I like that better. I think I said this several times last year where I don't think this team has the right personnel to press very well all the way across the field. And so I'd rather see them not try. And so I think I like that shift, but like the bend but don't break mentality only works for so long if you never actually win the ball. And we don't have many ball winners in this team, maybe any real ball winners in this team. Alex Ring in his prime, and I'd say even 2 years ago for Austin when he was playing that position, he covered a lot of ground, would kind of make these heroic runs to make these last ditch tackles. But when he's just playing in the midfield and goes up into a challenge, he's not that good at winning the ball. And we need someone who's able to do that. And so when you have Alex Ring playing as that lone six, he's not breaking the press on his own, but he's also not winning balls and breaking up transitions like you would hope he would be able to, right? And so that's that trade-off. I know a lot of people wanted to see Danny Pereira play up higher, but it took him out of the game a lot. He was not getting the ball in parts of the field in the first half where he could really affect the game at all. And so what you saw in the second half is Danny Pereira starts dropping in. And in the buildup, it's more of like a midfield two with Ring and Pereira both kind of dropping in and bringing the ball forward. And that's when you see Austin start to really put some pressure on Minnesota. They were not able to finish off any of the plays except for the last touch of the game. But they did finally start getting into the final third, start getting some of those patterns of play that Josh Wolf really wants them to get into. And Danny Pereira dropping back into the midfield to help in the buildup and really take advantage of his skill set is what allowed them to be able to do that.
Well, let's talk about the second half then and like how it changed. I mean, there was that transition, but also at 58, Austin got 3 subs. So Johan Valencia, Hunter Obrian, and Diego Rubio, all 3 come on. And so one, like, how does Valencia coming in like change the alignment of the midfield for people? And then like let's talk about like Rubio and Obrian like changing the energy in the attack.
Yeah, so what they ended up doing was pushing Ring a bit further forward and moving Valencia to that deeper central midfield spot. And then Obrian for Finley was just a straight swap on the right wing. Rubio for Zardes was a straight swap up top. And then they pushed Owen Wolf out to right fullback and were letting him push forward and get more into the attack. And so, I mean, I think a lot of it still was Danny getting involved because the change not all of the changes in the second half came with the substitutions. You saw some more momentum build before those even happened. I think what changed was once we got into, like, we broke that first line of pressure, what was happening after that, I think that's really where Rubio and Obrian were able to affect the game a little bit. It wasn't a ton of minutes. I don't think they were perfect, but I thought what they brought was much better than what we had on the field before. I thought Finley played not a great game. Zardes was kind of non-existent. And then I feel like, I don't know. Did Valencia stand out to you one way or the other at all while he was on the field?
He didn't stand out to me either way, which I think maybe is okay because that's a little bit of what you need from him. And I think what I saw out of him that you touched on is like him being there, a lot of other players to do other better things. What's funny, I was at the gym with a guy who goes to every game, and he was talking about Obrian. He's like, that guy makes things happen, half good, half bad. Like you never, right? He was all over the field, and sometimes he had a heavy touch, and sometimes he was in weird places. But you know, he was always a factor, which I think is a little bit of like an agent of chaos that Austin maybe needs and doesn't have too.
Yeah, so like looking for towards the lineup next week, um, I think Rubio, like he's still like at his age and the as little preseason as he got. I hope he's ready. I think that's the only reason he didn't start this game is because if he can't go 60, you can't really start him, right? Um, if he can go 60 in Seattle, I think he should, even if it's only 60. I think Biru is in a similar spot. We'll talk more about him as we get into the goals, but Obrian is in a spot where he got a full preseason, right? He had as much preseason as Ethan Finley did, maybe a slightly shorter one. So I would really like to see Hunter Obrian. I understand why that didn't happen. He is newer. You want with Driussi out, maybe you want some consistency in the lineup. But after the 30 minutes that we saw him play and the 60 minutes we saw Finley play, I would like to see Obrian definitely start in this next game.
And one of the reasons that I think that we should be open to seeing more changes earlier than one would expect, just generally knowing Josh Wolf, is this quote about how bad Austin was in the first half. He says it was unrecognizable from what our group has looked like in 6 or 7 weeks of preseason, from personality to speed to combativeness to dueling. It was sorely lacking in the things we preached on and been about in the preseason. Which, to follow through on that, like you think he would be open to making some changes and like having some real consequences for sort of like what happened in this half.
Yeah, and I mean it. Later in that press conference, it sounded like he was, but also kind of referenced like we wanted to make changes, but fitness is still a thing. Like fitness is still an issue here, and so like Biru played 30 minutes and looked tired already. So I don't think he's a candidate to start yet. Rubio, again, I hope he is, but I don't know if he is. Again, Obrian, though, I think he really is there, and then maybe some changes in the midfield as well. Owen Wolf showed some like some moments and some sparks where he showed his talent, but many other moments he was non-existent or bad. I thought he looked decent when he went in it, switched over to fullback, and then ends up getting the assist later in the game. But I think there's a chance we see Alex Ring, like it. We'll say if Driussi's not available, Alex Ring push forward, Valencia play the 6, and Danny kind of do what he did in the second half, where he's dropping in and helping in the build up, but then as we push forward, moving forward with the play.
And knowing that Driussi has a little bit of a knock and this game's on turf, that seems entirely reasonable that this is what we're going to see.
Yeah.